All rise. Veuillez vous lever. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Rebonjour.
Judge Motok. Hello again. Counsel, you can continue because we were interrupted by the pause. Over to you, legal representative for victim, please.
Thank you, Your Honors. I was in the process of explaining the spread of impunity in the Philippines, and I will resume, Your Honor. The plague of impunity has spread not only among Filipinos in the Philippines, but even among expatriate Filipinos in faraway lands like here in The Hague. When we reported to the victims that we, their external legal representatives, feel like fugitives who avoid our own countrymen here in The Hague because chances are they are Duterte clones, they expressed their utmost concern that if we, their lawyers, feel threatened by mini Dutertes in a foreign country, we should imagine the far more intense fear they live with every day in their communities teeming with mini Dutertes. The victims also wish to convey that if the judges of this honorable chamber can be subjected to online harassment by Duterte clones, we should imagine the level of vulnerability the victims are exposed to in their poor villages. Your Honors, there is only one solution to stop the impunity propagated by Mr. Duterte from continuing to bring harm and suffering to the victims. And that is for this honorable chamber to confirm the charges so that witnesses can testify and evidence can be presented on the horrible crimes committed by Mr. Duterte. The testimonies and evidence presented will inoculate these mini Dutertes from the virus of impunity that has infected them. When they will see and hear the utter cruelty, the sheer brutality, in other words, the brazen inhumanity of the crimes committed by Mr. Duterte, and the humanity of those whose lives were violently taken, it will rekindle the embers of humanity that still remain in their hearts. Many of these mini Dutertes or Duterte clones are actually victims of massive doses of fake news widely circulated online. They need to be vaccinated with the truth, and the truth vaccine can only come from the testimonies of victims and evidence presented in a trial before this court. Truth is the antidote to the virus of impunity, Your Honors. The victims dread a future where charges are not confirmed in this case. It will mean that the virus of impunity will continue to spread and infect many more. Victims fear that Duterte clones will become an even bigger group that can elect another apostle of impunity as the Philippines' next leader. If that happens, an even more serious condition of impunity can take place in the Philippines, possibly worse than the orgy of violence that happened from 2011 to 2019, and this time there will be no ICC to run to for assistance and help. The victims humbly beseech this honorable chamber to reaffirm the two crucial objectives of the ICC identified in the preamble of the Rome Statute. First, to prosecute and punish the most serious crimes that deeply shock the conscience of humanity. And second, to put an end to impunity and to contribute to the prevention of crimes of unimaginable atrocities. If this chamber confirms the charges, this court will achieve its first objective of prosecuting and, if convicted, punishing Mr. Duterte for the unspeakable crimes he is charged with. But achieving the first objective will not automatically make this court attain its second objective. Merely putting forward the evidence gathered and the theory of liability of the prosecution will not necessarily result to ending impunity and contributing to the prevention of further unimaginable crimes, which is the court's second objective. This court should allow victims to testify, and the record of the proceedings must reflect the harrowing experiences of those impacted by the crimes. They are the humanity referred to by Article 7's framework of crimes against humanity. It is the view of the victims that this court must allow them to narrate the gravity, the cruelty, and the brutality. In other words, the utter inhumanity of the crimes masterminded by Mr. Duterte, so that the people who adore and idolize him, the people who have become disciples of impunity, will see for themselves the inhumanity of the suspect. For this to happen, the charges should all be confirmed. The virus of impunity that has spread all over the Philippines is very grave and serious, Your Honors. Imagine a leader like Mr. Duterte, who proudly and publicly proclaimed his aspirations of following the footsteps of Adolf Hitler when he said, quote, "Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now there are 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them," unquote. And yet, he is worshipped by a huge number of Filipinos. In so many countries, you will need to hide your adoration of Hitler. Mr. Duterte flaunted it, and his fanatics are unaffected by it. Mr. Duterte has pronounced so many other horrible declarations meant to promote and encourage impunity, as it will be detailed tomorrow by my colleagues. And yet, he is idolized by a multitude of Filipinos. The defense will claim that he was merely bombastic and acerbic when he made these statements. But if he were merely being pompous and flippant, the people who were killed should be alive and laughing today at his supposed pranks and stunts. Mr. Duterte did not only order the mass killing of people suspected of being drug personalities, Your Honors. He smeared them with accusations of being rapists, murderers, and dangerous criminals. Mr. Duterte imposed an inflexible condemnation that if you are a drug personality, you are automatically a dangerous criminal who has engaged in unimaginable atrocities. The families of those killed did not only suffer the loss of a loved one, their families were even disgraced with being associated with a rapist, murderer, or dangerous criminal. Even after their loved ones were murdered, many families were subjected to deplorable injustices. Instead of gunshot wounds as cause of death in their death certificates, families were shocked to see pneumonia, heart attack, stroke, sepsis, and other false causes of death that were instead written down. Other families were charged substantial amounts. Some the impoverished families could not afford, just to retrieve the bodies of their loved ones from the funeral parlor who were suspected by the families of being in cahoots with the police officers. Some family members were even arrested and imprisoned by police officers on false charges and for the purpose of preventing them from complaining. In one particular incident, Your Honors, a young man and his common-law wife were sleeping in their shanty when men in civilian clothes knocked down the door to their house. The men dragged the wife out of the room. The husband was already surrendering, and he even started to strip naked to show he had no drugs or firearm on his body. He said in the Filipino language, "Sir, malinis po ako, maghuhubad ako, sir." Translation in English, "Sir, I am clean. I will strip naked, sir." Still without mercy, the men shot and killed him. After killing the husband, they arrested the wife and accused her with falsified and non-bailable charges. When the deceased mother and cousin went to the police station to find out what happened to the young man, because they were not in the scene of the crime when it happened, the two were also summarily arrested and charged with fabricated crimes. If the Honorable Chamber confirms the charges in this case, the witnesses and evidence will show that those who were smeared by Mr. Duterte before they were killed, they were inside their houses, sleeping peacefully with their families, eating meals with their loved ones, playing with their children, or hugging their wives. Others were merely walking along the street, having snacks at a roadside eatery, or plying the road, earning a poor man's living. They were all doing ordinary, peaceful, and plain human activities. Confirming the charges will restore the dignity of those who were killed and the honor of their families. The prejudice suffered by the families of those killed did not begin and end with the killings of their loved ones. Each killing set off a chain reaction that is continuously churning out a daily crucible of harm, damage, and loss. By masterminding the mass murder of mere suspects, Mr. Duterte has brought irreparable and endless harm to the families. An overwhelming majority of those killed were the sole breadwinners of poor families. These families were dependent on each day's wage for their daily sustenance. They were hand-to-mouth families. With the death of their breadwinners, the widowed spouses, a majority of whom are women, have had to take on the roles of two parents. On top of taking care of their children and maintaining the household, the widowed spouses now have the additional burden of being breadwinners for their families. Families have been driven to even far more serious destitution, Your Honors. The damage to the children is immeasurable. Their development and upbringing have been permanently compromised. They have been walking through life with one missing parental limb. Losing a parent under very dire economic conditions and under the most violent circumstances results in wounds that will never heal and that will absolutely render them handicapped for life. And then there's the indescribable anguish of parents who lost a child. No parent is supposed to outlive a child. Parents suffer a lifetime of grief when a child dies ahead of them, and the lifetime grief is unimaginably worse when a child dies under the most inhuman circumstances. The crimes masterminded by Mr. Duterte did not only affect individuals but whole communities. Across the Philippines, numerous urban communities of the most impoverished villages were scarred by the violence and abuses wrought by a lawless anti-drug campaign that further worsened the misery and trauma of residents in marginalized communities. In one illustrative instance, Your Honors, after the father of a family was killed inside his house by police officers, the entire neighborhood was so traumatized that for almost 3 months, and during the coldest months in the Philippines, they abandoned their houses at night and instead slept in the open public market. They did not feel secure inside their houses because there would be no witnesses if the police would just barge in and shoot at them. In the public market, the presence of many witnesses, they thought, will deter the police from shooting and killing them. It is also the victim's view, Your Honors, that the charges should be confirmed because the resulting presentation of witnesses and evidence during the trial will force police and other law enforcement officers to confront the brazen depravity of the killing of civilians that they either personally committed or allowed to be committed during the Duterte reign of terror. In one operation, the police summarily killed 3 men, 2 brothers and 1 friend, in the very early morning. The police declared that the three were nanlaban. They fought back. But the neighbors saw otherwise. The whole neighborhood was so horrified at the macabre treatment of one of the fatalities. The bullet-ridden body of one of the three men was brought out from the second-floor window and dropped to the ground because the police could not bring the body out through the doorway. When the body hit the ground, the neighbors recoiled at hearing the body emit a cry, aray. Translation in English, ouch. The man was still alive when his body was thrown to the ground, and the police just left him to bleed to death. The trial will hold a mirror to the police force and compel them to see how they were turned into executioners and assassins, and their organization transformed into a gigantic criminal organization or turned into a killing machine by Mr. Duterte. The Philippine National Police and the drug enforcement agencies have not made any initiative to purify the corrupted minds of their officers and personnel to our knowledge. The trial in this case will be a tremendous teaching opportunity that can work to rectify the warped and depraved minds of Philippine security officers. The charges need to be confirmed, Your Honors, for the sake of the entire country, which has been desensitized or made numb by the massive incidents of impunity and the glorification of impunity promoted by Mr. Duterte. The whole Philippines needs to know the real story during those bloody years. There has been no opportunity for the entire country to really find out the whole truth of what happened. It has been hush-hush, tidbits of sporadic news, and always drowned out by trolls who mass produce and broadcast false, fake, and fabricated news. The victims also attach a very important historical significance to this case. If the Chamber confirms the charges, the trial proceedings will produce a historical record of the most bloody period of post-war Philippine history, a duty that the Philippine justice system has refused to perform. The historical account on the mass murder of so many Filipinos during the Duterte regime needs to be accessible to our future generations, just like the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, so that they will learn from it and not repeat the same mistake of selecting and glorifying leaders who preach and practice impunity. The prosecution has presented 78 instances of murder and attempted murder, clarifying that these incidents are only representatives of the extent of the crimes committed against thousands of civilians, Your Honors. The victims beseech the Honorable Chamber to remember that Mr. Duterte's bloody rule, both in Davao City and nationwide, resulted in as many as 30,000 victims of killings, more than 300,000 victims of arbitrary imprisonment, and unaccounted numbers of victims of torture, sexual assault, and other forms of crimes against humanity. For many families in the Philippines, the charges brought for confirmation in these proceedings represent only a fraction of the reality the victims have endured. The victims beseech the Honorable Chamber to remember the hundreds of thousands of victims are banking on vicarious justice from this case. Finally, Your Honors.
Excuse me, Counsel, you have 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Finally, Your Honors, the victims wish to humbly underline that what is ultimately at stake in these proceedings is the supreme of all forms of human rights, the right to life. The right to life is the very foundation of every civilized society. The ancestors of every nation fought against invaders, colonizers, despotic monarchs, and fascist leaders in order to secure the right to life of their families, their communities, and the future generations. The heroes of every country sacrificed their lives to defend the right to life of their people. We as citizens of modern societies are inheritors and beneficiaries of the sacrifices of our ancestors who bequeathed to us the right to life. We owe it to them to defend this supreme legacy for our generation and for the generations to come. For the past few years, Your Honors, we have seen an increasing number of nation leaders who time-traveled from the Dark Ages and now swagger in modern times as if they own people's lives. These brutal and cruel leaders must be held to account for their brazen disregard of humankind's right to life. Our ancestors fought in the battlefield to secure a right to life. In these modern times, the battleground for the fight to protect our right to life is within the four walls of this honorable court. May the God of life, the God of humanity, guide the honorable members of this chamber. Thank you, Your Honors.
Merci beaucoup, Maître Boutouyan.
Judge Motog. Thank you very much, Counsel Boutouyan. Now over to the defence. Mr. Kaufman, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Your Honours. And I thank Mr. Boutouyan for his intervention. But I feel that I ought to remind him that this is a court of law which decides matters on the basis of evidence, not on the basis of political demagoguery, and not on the basis of a desire to effect regime change despite the democratic will. And certainly not on the basis of statements made by Ombudsman Jesus Crispin Remula, who professed that domestic justice will be denied, according to Mr. Boutouyan, because of the lack of forensic reports and police reports. Now, I don't know which case Mr. Boutouyan's metaphorical ship sailed into, but he clearly hasn't read the evidence. Whilst he was speaking, we examined the evidence, and out of that evidence, we found at least 35 reports substantiating 49 of the incidents which are mentioned in a document containing the charges. Your Honours, Rodrigo Duterte was and will always remain a unique phenomenon. His style of statesmanship was novel and unpalatable to many. His expletives and hyperbole grated, while his honesty and wild popularity irritated. He spoke openly, from the heart, sincerely and truthfully. And what a contrast between him and his successor in the Malacanang. For President Rudy, his word was his word, and the people knew it. For President Bong Bong, his word is for the wind, and the people will not forget it. Let me remind everyone of the letter which President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. signed, it's on the screen, and in which he gave a cast-iron undertaking that his government, and I quote, will not assist the ICC in any way, shape, or form. Well, as we know, he failed to keep that promise. Rodrigo Duterte was unconstitutionally hijacked and unceremoniously hauled off to The Hague. And when called upon to defend his master's actions and the said letter at a Senate committee hearing, the then Secretary for Justice, once again Mr. Jesus Crispin Remula, persisted with the same dishonest theme. And I quote his words, "We did not assist the ICC. We continue with the very tenor of the letter that we did not assist the ICC and we did not have any contact with them." So he said, but with a document emanating from the prosecution team opposite and disclosed to us a mere week ago, not as information material to the preparation of our defence, but as exonerating evidence, we can now substantiate what we have suspected for a long time. The document comprises a transcript of a telephone call covertly recorded between four parties who cannot be mentioned in public, and one of these parties was boasting about how he was acting as the silent partner of President BBM, managing a scheme to funnel witnesses to this court while all the time ensuring that he could guarantee President BBM's plausible deniability. So it is indeed the defence case that President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. set out to neutralise Rodrigo Duterte and his legacy Yes, Mr. Deputy Prosecutor, I used that legendary word, neutralize, so central and so essential to your case theory, because you know just as well as me that I'm using the term metaphorically. And now I turn to the substance of the charges, but before I do, a word or two about the geopolitical context. The scourge of illegal narcotics is not unique to the Philippines. As we all know, it afflicts Latin America, where I can name 3 countries where the death rate at the hands of vigilantes and law enforcement agents per capita population is higher than it ever was under Duterte. And as you should know, and you will hear from the prosecution, at any rate, the Philippines as a country is uniquely positioned to act as a transit hub for the trafficking of narcotics emanating from the cartels in China. And with or without Duterte, so we argue, the death rate would have kept on rising. Indeed, as we will prove with statistics and reports, the death rate flowing from narcotics-related crime actually increased after Rodrigo Duterte left power. And where, I ask you, has the International Criminal Court been since? Now, a colleague of the victim's representative sitting opposite, a certain self-styled legal assistant to ICC counsel, rose up and famously stated in one of her many voluble interviews to the media that Rodrigo Duterte conducted not a war on drugs, but a war on the poor. A war on the poor, I ask you? If anything, the totally lawful Duterte campaign against illegal drugs and their suppliers took place when his administration was actively promoting some of the most important redistributive policies in years, all with the aim of alleviating poverty. Legislative reform in 2017 to reduce personal income taxes for workers, social protection expansion known as the 4 Ps, designed to provide regular cash transfers to needy and multi-child families, universal health care, and need I say more, the Magna Carta of the poor, setting out the right to adequate food, decent shelter, education, and a highest standard of health. The fact that the majority of those who died as a result of drug-related crime were living in the most deprived areas is something which is endemic to every afflicted society. But can anyone seriously accuse this man, Rodrigo Duterte, who has lived such an openly frugal existence, of taking up arms against the needy? This is the man who at the age of 5 arrived in Davao to live in a modest shack where rain leaked through the roof, forcing him to crawl under the kitchen table to take shelter. This is not the man born with a silver spoon in his mouth and groomed for the presidency from childhood. This is the man who was born to a lawyer and a governor who taught him discipline, values, and respect for the people by being one of the people. This is the man who, as president himself, shunned the luxuries and the privileges of high office, and like others before him, and even those after him, he slept not in the palatial grandeur of the Malacanang, but in Spartan quarters of his bodyguard's hut. His diet consisted not of prime cuts of imported Australian beef, but of dried fish and boiled rice. A man of simple indulgences, his pleasures were to be found not on the cocktail party circuit of Forbes Park, but on coastal roads where he roamed and cruised on his motorcycle, not looking for people to kill, Mr. Prosecutor, but almost killing himself because of his love for speed. This is the man who paid and paved his way through law school, passing his bar exam in 1972, more or less on the same day as Marcos Sr.'s tanks were grinding and rolling their way through the streets after the declaration of martial law. And it was on that significant day that Rodrigo Duterte was exposed to the tyranny of oppression and the abuse of power by the elite. And he took a decision. On that day, he chose to devote himself to a life of selfless public service. As a professor at the local police academy and as a public prosecutor in Davao, Rodrigo Duterte developed a lifelong passion, some would say an enduring obsession, for law and order, something for which he unapologetically enforced throughout his time as mayor of Davao City. Not, as the prosecution say, through sowing murder and mayhem, but through winning the love, respect, and admiration of his fellow citizens. The very same citizens who continued to re-elect him time after time, term after term, on no less than 7 occasions over more than 2 decades. And throughout his 20 or so years tenure as the mayor of Davao, Rodrigo Duterte and his family transformed that city from an outpost of communist insurgency and criminal violence into what is now one of the safest cities, not just in the Philippines, but in the entire world. This was indeed the so-called Davao model, which the prosecution wants to persuade you was code for unbridled criminal violence. And this was the type of leader that the Filipino nation wanted in 2016. So, Rodrigo Duterte was elected into power, not in spite of, but specifically because of his firm and uncompromising commitment to upholding law and order. And after his election as president, Rodrigo Duterte remained a man of the people, without seeking to patronize the people. Gung-ho in his ways and with a belligerent tone, he spoke the tough tongue of the street, not the dissembling discourse of international diplomacy. He said what the people wanted to hear, but he said it in a way that offended sensibilities of world leaders unaccustomed to hearing it, one in particular, and that was what set him on the slippery slope to a prison cell in The Hague. And let me tell you how it works. It starts with the media, controlled by the powerful and the politically influential. With a sensational headline and a twisted editorial slant, the moguls sell their papers while promoting the partisan agenda of their backers in power. They highlight the salacious content while ignoring the true context, because that is what captivates the reader. And so it was with Rodrigo Duterte, whose speeches were fertile fodder for his enemies and detractors. A man whose hyperbole, bluster, and rhetoric, once published, became a natural target for privately funded NGOs and human rights activists, a loose collective more commonly known as civil society. These people descended upon the Philippines to advance an agenda even more lacking in objectivity than that of the media, and heavily funded by tycoons with even grander designs, they print their glossy reports, replete with iconic photographic images of grieving families and dead bodies in rain-swept, nighttime crime scenes, all dramatically illuminated with the fluorescent glow of neon. Images carefully crafted to shock the conscience and to sway the emotions, and, I may say, to be used by the prosecutor when they don't even relate to the charges. And they gave their slick reports bold titles lifted straight out of a James Bond movie, such as License to Kill, One Shot to the Head, You Can Die Anytime, or simply, They Just Kill. The photographers are fated and their shots exhibited as art all over the world, and the brave journalists who act as their sources win awards and Nobel Prizes. And slowly but surely, their narrative becomes the sacred, unchallengeable, and unshakable truth. And so the pressure builds up, and the academics who haunt the corridors of the progressive left law faculties far away in the United States tweet their research and publish their articles pontificating about crimes against humanity, systematic attacks against the civilian population, and they point their finger at one man alone, and bandy about slogans such as accountability and the prevention of impunity. They give their gratuitous advice on what should be done, sometimes academics who formerly worked alongside the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Communications and complaints are filed, and the rest, as they say, is history. In any event, we're not gathered here today to judge a man on the basis of his coarse attitude or his vulgar language. This court has convened a confirmation hearing to verify whether substantial grounds exist to believe that Rodrigo Duterte, the people's president, together with various so-called co-perpetrators, over the years of his governance, devised a criminal policy of wholesale and wanton murder. And since we are in a court of law, it is worth stressing, although I should not have to, cases are decided on the basis of evidence, not supposition, not rumour, not spicy gossip, and certainly not on the basis of political rhetoric and bluster. Because at the end of the day, were it not for those belligerent and controversial speeches, there would have been no impetus to bring the people's president to The Hague. And when the prosecution's evidence is examined, I would ask you to keep an open mind and to question not just whether that evidence has been selectively presented, but whether there exists evidence which the prosecution has failed to produce. And I say this with justifiable cause, particularly with respect to the Duterte rhetoric, as we will prove during the substantive part of our submissions. The notorious speeches on which the prosecution relies have been cherry-picked to suit its narrative, while ignoring the many other speeches when the former president tempered his bombastic language by clear reference to the principle of lawful self-defense. We, the defense, have read as many of these speeches as we can find. In fact, in our poky little office on the top floor of the furthest building away in this complex, we have a counter which ticks and ticks. And whenever we come across a speech which contradicts the prosecution's murder theory by reference to self-defense, we give a cheer. And the counter goes up once more, and we celebrate one more nail in the coffin of the prosecution's case theory. As the statistics stand as of today, in contrast to the 20 speeches on which the prosecution relies to prove incitement to kill, we have found 35 more which say the complete opposite. Let me give you 2 examples from the very speeches that the deputy prosecutor himself cited today. Let's refer first of all to the famous Pietà speech, which the deputy prosecutor referred to. So this is what the deputy prosecutor said. Those of you who are still sober, those who haven't tried illegal drugs, if you don't want to die or get hurt, don't rely on the priests, including human rights advocates. They won't be able to prevent deaths, and so it goes on. But if we look further on in the very same speech, something which maybe the deputy prosecutor didn't do, this is what he had to say. To our police officers and other officials, do your job, and you will have the unwavering support of the office of the President. I will be with you all the way. Abuse your authority, and there will be hell to pay, for you will have become worse than criminality itself. Well, there you are. You have it straight in your face. Pexo, exonerating evidence within what is claimed to be the prosecution incriminating evidence. I won't take up my time by showing you the second speech, but there is one. If I have time at the end, I will show it to you. So if you add to that another 10 speeches out of the 20 speeches on which the prosecution rely in its document containing the charges, after all, we are in a court of law and we rely on evidence. And what is the evidence that's produced of these speeches? 20 of them. 10 of them, I submit, and we will show this in the substantive part of our submissions, contain exonerating evidence which support the defense case theory. In other words, if you add the 10 which we've identified in the prosecution's 20, to our total of 35, we come to 45 speeches versus 10, which we say support the use of force only in self-defense. That is 350% more speeches in favor of our defense and 354% more reasons not to confirm the charges. And you can bet your bottom dollar that at the end of today's proceedings, either the victim's self-styled legal assistant to ICC counsel or a prosecution intern will be tasked with scouring the web, looking for the means to prove Kaufman wrong. And I will declare it, and I'll declare it loudly and clearly, as if the prosecution didn't know it already. It's not enough to state that since the former president made those extremely inflammatory statements and deaths occurred, that he must, as a matter of course, be criminally responsible for those fatalities. At this stage of the proceedings, the prosecution needs to show substantial grounds to believe that the former president actually desired and foresaw that people would be killed as a result of his incendiary language. For the prosecution to assert that Rodrigo Duterte hoped for deaths to occur or was recklessly indifferent as to whether deaths would occur, which he was not, that's insufficient. So once more for the record, Rodrigo Duterte's language was aimed not at suspected drug pushers as the prosecution would have it, but directly at those poisoning society with their substances, and not, I stress, with lethal intent. His rhetoric was calculated to arouse fear and obedience, to instill fear in their hearts, and to inculcate a respect for the law in their minds. Nothing more, nothing less. That was his intent, and it was not criminal. And as many of these drug pushers demanded to enter prison, I remember seeing the images on the television, lining up to surrender and to enter prison. Now, I challenge my colleagues opposite to prove otherwise, because as we all know, in a criminal process, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. They brought this case and they need to prove it. Rodrigo Duterte need not convince the world of anything, and that is to his fortunate advantage given his current medical condition. He stands behind his legacy resolutely, and he maintains his innocence absolutely. Now, I turn to the general fairness and objectivity of the investigation, which, as we all know, is meant to be an impartial evidence-gathering exercise. As an ex-prosecutor myself, I'm used to investigating agencies pursuing all reasonable lines of inquiry, assimilating all testimonies, and digesting all documentation and forensic evidence, recommending who to target for prosecution, but not so with this prosecution. When we, the defense, study the course of the investigation in this case, one thing is plain as a pikestaff. The chief prosecutor of this court, Mr. Karim Khan, not only failed miserably to carry out his duties under the Rome Statute, requiring him to examine exonerating circumstances as well as incriminating, but he single-handedly contaminated it, so we alleged, by pursuing a one-track crusade with a view to a predetermined objective. Let me explain. Although the ICC officially authorized an investigation into the so-called Philippines situation in late 2021, it was deferred a few months later back to the Philippines for the official investigation to resume only in late 2023. But the real meat of the investigation into count 1, relating to the activities of that fictitious construct, the Davao Death Squad, had effectively started way before then, with the sole objective of nailing Rodrigo Duterte. Indeed, all the way back in 2018, during its so-called preliminary examination, the prosecution had an individual who will be referred to as P1, handed to them on a silver platter. This P1 had been interviewed at an earlier date by none other than Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, in his former capacity as a private lawyer, and the self-professed legal Rodrigo Duterte's role as the mobster-in-chief. The same her preparation. And what was this information with which Karim Khan had helpfully provided her? A book on which the prosecution relies as evidence. A trashy, scurrilous item of pulp fiction entitled Duterte Harry. Your Honours, the picture on the front cover of that book says it all. It really does scream objectivity, doesn't it? I say that sarcastically, of course. Fortunately for us, the defence, the appeals chamber, has now disqualified Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan from this case. A welcome development as a matter of ethical propriety, but in our opinion, too late in the day to salvage the integrity of the investigation that he had supervised. An investigation in the course of which he concealed his former role as the victim's counsel, who had deemed our client a suspected murderer as far back as 2018 and right up to the very day before this pre-trial chamber issued its arrest warrant. Your Honours, over the next few days, we hope to convince you of the wholly insufficient nature of the evidence against Rodrigo Duterte. We will show you that the paltry number of speeches on which the prosecution rely do not manifest criminal intent. We will also convince you that as hard as they tried, the prosecution's investigators couldn't get even one of its criminal cooperating witnesses, whose reliability is next to zero, to admit that they heard the former president, Rodrigo Duterte, give an order to kill at any time relevant to the charges, or with respect to any of the incidents. And we hope that when you conclude your deliberations, Your Honours, that you will dismiss these grievously misplaced and politically motivated charges. We will ask you to send Rodrigo Duterte back to his family, and we will ask you to give back to the Filipino people their tatay digong. Thank you, Your Honours.
The presiding judge. Thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman. We shall now suspend. This is the end of initial statements, and this is the end of this morning's hearings. We will take a 90-minute break and resume at 2 in the afternoon. Thank you very much.